Hello, this is Bruce Perens from Berkeley, California, and let's talk about building a $1 billion company with Crystal and the Lucky Framework. So who am I? I'm one of the founders of the open source movement in software. I created the open source definition, rules for open source licensing, which still stand today, and did a lot of other things in the creation of this community. I'm a systems programmer since 1981. So I'm an old guy. I was in the feature film business at Pixar for 12 years, 19 in total. I'm a generalist. I've published in intellectual property, computer science, business strategy, and public policy. I'm a worldwide public speaker, including to the United Nations and national governments. So what's Coast Capital? Commercial Open Source Software Capital, formerly OSS Capital, is a 3-year-old venture capital company. We exclusively invest in commercial open source. We have tens of millions of US dollars invested. I can't get more specific. I evaluate companies for investment, and I'm building a venture studio which develops new companies internally. My title is founding board partner. So I'm supposed to sit on executive boards of companies. Doesn't happen yet. I'm not rich. It takes a long time for a VC to make money, and most fail. So being a VC isn't much like being an open source developer. We get direct monetary rewards for our success. In contrast, too often someone else gets rewarded for the open source developer's success. We'll talk later about how to fix that. We're legally responsible to make money for our investors. We can fail, but we can't ignore that mission. We can't always afford to be nice. We're competitive. I notice in the developer community, people sort of shy away from competition. They don't want to do head-to-head comparisons between their project and another project, etc. We do that stuff. We don't feel the least bit bad about it. And we and our companies produce open source as part of a strategy to produce direct income. There's always a tension between doing the best for open source and making money. There are always ethical compromises. I'd like to fix that too. We'll discuss how later. So what am I doing with Crystal and Lucky? Well, during COVID, when there was an economic lull, I started working on a company outside of Coast Capital to fulfill an unmet need on the web. And there are lots of unmet needs still left to capitalize upon on the web. I selected the Crystal language and the Lucky web framework. Crystal has several web frameworks. The application that I've written is meant to be desirable to everyone everywhere. And I'm not aiming low. The plan is for this to develop into a $1 billion company. Of course, that's no sure thing. I'll make open source utilities as part of this work, but the app will remain proprietary. So Ruby and Rails are Crystal and Lucky's ancestors. For years, Ruby on Rails was the darling of the venture capital community. Why was that? It accelerated time to market. You could get an application done fast. It made the best use of developers. It didn't waste their time the way some languages do. But Ruby and Rails are not correct, reliable, or efficient. When you program in Ruby, unfortunately, bugs wait until production to reveal themselves, or they require extensive testing. But Ruby and Rails were good enough for making lots and lots of money. Well, Crystal and Lucky follow them as the new darling of the venture capital and startup communities. Well, what do they do differently? Crystal and Lucky attempt to take all the good of Ruby and add correct reliable, and efficient. So there's less time wasted writing tests. There's a large class of errors that Crystal tells you about at compile time that Ruby wasted developer time writing exhaustive testing, or the bug popped up in front of your user. Um, Crystal and Lucky have 3 times better performance than Ruby, but it almost doesn't matter because computers are cheap, developers aren't. Performance is only a key advantage for compute tasks like image processing, like we did at Pixar. It's a nice plus for web development, but not really essential. So Lucky and Crystal still let the developer down in some ways. Lucky uses Crystal's macro system extensively all over, and bugs in your code that are manifested within a macro that you call tend to result in just inscrutable error reports for code lines far from your mistake. The time to debug these reduces programmer productivity. The runtime the runtime debugger support is brand new. It's poorly documented. It's not ready for most coders. Compilation time is too long for large programs. Global optimization and implicit typing mean less opportunity for incremental compilation. You have to recompile more of the program when anything changes. The result was I had to buy faster computers for development, not production, to avoid wasting time on compiles and having to wait for compile. Where are we heading? Crystal is a good choice for web development. I think it will be utilized in venture-funded development. Involvement of the Manas company makes it easier to bank on language. In contrast, Lucky is being supported by developers who use it in their own projects. And it's lost a key developer for now. He has a new baby. Well, that's great, but the project is a little slowed down. Another Crystal web development platform could still achieve dominance. Well, here I am, the VC, caring about dominance. Companies will bank on the one with the largest ecosystem. So I'm going to take off my VC hat now and put on my community hat. This part of the talk has nothing to do with Post Capital. We have a contract that allows me to state my own opinions. They don't necessarily agree with these, although I think this one will eventually help them and their companies. We've been doing free software for 38 years. If you look at the date of the original bulletin that announced well, it was 3 freedoms then. It's now 4 freedoms of free software. And we've been doing open source for 25. We've had enough time to learn about free software and open source and to move on to a better paradigm. So the large corporations eventually figured out how to deal with open source. That's what's wrong. And they arrived at a resource extraction paradigm. So they treat us like miners digging up diamonds or sucking oil out of the ground, or loggers cutting the trees. The resource extraction paradigm maximally exploits a natural resource, us, the developers, because the largest corporations really own organizations like Linux Foundation. There are no developers controlling that organization anymore. It's only big corporations. The largest corporations actually speak for the developers. It's very inappropriate. It's like loggers speaking for the trees. And really, the largest corporations own open source. We use the licenses that are most advantageous to them because the corporations control the dialogue. So you use a BSD or MIT or Apache license, because it's very easy for the biggest corporations to mix that with proprietary software. We use governance that deprives the creators of the software of any power over it. Again, because the corporations control the dialogue. The Open Invention Network exists to protect the corporations that own it and their patent portfolios from patent reforms driven by the open source community. It doesn't exist to protect you from software patenting. An important community organization, I shouldn't name, agreed not to lobby for patent-free standards at the behest of their corporate donors. But patent-free standards are very important to open source developers since we can't license the patents that are often embedded in these standards. I was on the call with this organization agreed not to lobby for that. None of this is to the advantage of the individual developer like you or me, or the small company like Manas, or any of the companies that Post Capital invests in, or even the VCs themselves. It's only to the advantage of the largest corporation. It gets worse. Our software is used to deprive individuals of their privacy and to control their opinion by controlling what they see. I don't know about you, but I create software for free and give it away for everyone to use to enable people and to give them freedom. That doesn't seem to be working out as well as we intended. We need to look at our priorities. Open source has the wrong priorities today. It's more important to donate your work to help individuals than to make yourself an unpaid employee of the richest companies in the world, which is what you do when you give them your work for free. Open source has failed to compensate its developers and has succeeded in making billionaires out of those who exploit us and exploit others with our software. We can't afford our own public relations, so we can't speak for ourselves to the public. So the corporations speak for us. We can't afford to sue the violators of our licenses, so our licenses mean nothing. And unfortunately, we can't fix open source. And we shouldn't. Open source will continue to have a function, will continue to be important, and should be preserved the way it is. When you say open source, it should mean the licensing that exists today. We can't fix this by just making another open source license. We need a new paradigm with new rules, and I call it post-open. So how does post-open work? This is what I propose. One license, just one, for all the software, and one developer agreement. It creates a patent-free zone among developers and users. Source code availability, the right to use, modify, and redistribute all the things that have been important to free software for 38 years are still preserved in post-open. It's always free of charge for individuals and tax-exempt nonprofits, but it's not free for everything. We charge the user 1% of end user revenue for uses that create income for a business. The same fee, whether you use one post-open program or 1,000. So once you're into this, your incentive to use all the software, not just a piece. And you don't have to consider, oh, should I use another program? I'll have to pay more. This makes compliance much easier for companies. And if you talk to companies, compliance is their biggest problem, not money. You run an audit tool to report what software you're using. You fill out a short form and you pay, and it only happens once a year. You don't do license analysis. You don't scan for copyright infringement all over your own, etc. Income is distributed to developers according to the use reports. I could do a whole separate talk about why that will work now. And this is not cutting out the open source developers. If you use open source software, that gets recorded. And when you use open source combined with post-open software, a payment to the open source developer is required, just like a payment to the post-open developer. So that makes sure the open source developers are taken care of and even provides them a sort of migration path to post-open if they like to take it, if they can keep developing under their open source license and make money. There are abusive uses that I'd like to take care of. So you pay 1.5% revenue, not 1%, if you don't share all modifications with the public. And when I say share, what we mean this time is publish on the web and do it fast. This isn't don't distribute source until you distribute a binary like the GPL. It's designed to encourage companies that can share freely. They save 0.5% on what they pay. We use APIs that are explicitly declared by the developers of Public as a metric of the boundaries of the program. So we don't depend on linking to say where one program starts and the other ends the way the GPL does. That doesn't work anymore. Unlike the GPL, we use contract terms explicitly. We don't depend exclusively on copyright. And about those abusive uses, there are really two that I'd like to go after. One is if you embed your software in a platform with digital rights management or lockdown hardware, you pay 10% instead of 1% or 1.5%. That's because we need hardware to run our programs on. We have to be able to change the software. If you perform our software as a service that provides essentially the same functionality as the software itself, the Amazon paradigm, you pay 10% rather than 1% or 1.5%. So what aren't goals? You've heard of ethical licensing. It's not a goal. I could do a whole speech on why it doesn't work. We're not shooting for early corporate involvement. They're going to hate it. They're going to badmouth us, just as they did about open source. Remember Craig Mundy saying open source is a cancer? Well, he learned, didn't he? It will eventually be to the advantage of large corporations to participate once the body of software under post-open licensing is sufficient. We're okay with this taking a long time. So what's the progress so far on developing a license? It's not very good yet. It hasn't seen a lawyer for the first time yet. Obviously, that's necessary before anyone could use it. I haven't started on the developer agreement. I have a talk on YouTube you can watch called What Comes After Open Source. I'll continue to develop the idea, to develop promotion of the idea, and to discuss it publicly. And now it's time for Q&A. I essentially did 2 talks rather than just one. So please ask questions about either one. Thanks very much.
There's a lot going on in the chat. Here we have Greg Buchek, who is asking if you have a plan to version the license and agreement like GPL and CC.
Well, let's take a look at what happened with GPL. So GPL 2.0 has been out for quite a long time. And when GPL 2.0 came out, the most complicated user interface device in a home was a touch-tone telephone. People were not on the internet. And GPL, based on linking, because at that time, linking was the way that we put programs together. So if you link new code into a GPL program, that became the same program under the GPL. Now we have all of these object brokers and IPC and multiple coprocessors working together. So linking isn't a good idea to use as a boundary of a program. You'll notice there was a case, Oracle versus Google, that discussed API copyright. And fortunately, we've, as a community, kind of missed the bullet on API copywriting so far, because if APIs were strongly copyrightable, that would mean we wouldn't be able to re-implement them in open source, and that would be really bad. However, we can still, using contract, make our APIs a boundary between two programs. And so that gives us a way to say, if you add to this piece, you don't have to share your code. And if you add to another, you do. So as you can see, we've gone through a whole lot of changes since GPL 2.0. It will be necessary to version the license. It will be necessary to have a license committee with community participation. And I'm hoping that we can just have it so that everyone's license upgrades to the new one, but that depends on whether they trust the community. Now here's a question from Valentine. What prevents a for-profit from operating a nonprofit shell? Hey, I worked in the movie business, so I know all about this. If your film made a profit, you had done your accounting wrong. So what prevents that from happening is that we base the revenues that we collect on end user revenue, not what you get paid to run the program. And that actually makes it harder for the company that has to pay us, because they have to account for end user revenue, and that revenue may be spread across more than one company. But it's the only way to avoid the shell companies. I know Qualcomm, for example, has a shell company that they use to avoid having to put their patents under terms of GPL and other licenses. Okay, and
We have another one from Greg. He's saying,
okay.
how do we get people and companies to start using post-open software? Maybe
Well,
a choice
we
of
have
post-open
to,
and copyleft licenses?
there are a couple steps before we get there. And the very first one is that I have to finish my work on the legal part and get that work to an attorney and work with that attorney so that the license actually does what it's supposed to, and so that you as a developer can trust it. Long ago, we had this idea open source, which frankly, when it came out, I don't think anybody except a few of us developers would have thought it would work or could work. I mean, the concept, for example, of a bunch of friends writing their own encyclopedia, people would have thought I was crazy if I brought that up when open source started. And of course, Wikipedia essentially put Encyclopedia Britannica and Carta and all the others out of business. So I'm actually pretty sanguine that we can get this working, and the motivation for developers is better fairness. We know how we're exploited today, and actually making some money. I didn't quite understand the question about the 1% cost to their own post-open licensed code. There is a term about the actual post-open developers, and they are assumed to use post-open code extensively, and that just comes out of what they are paid. You take that 1% out of what they are paid. And this has been kind of interesting because obviously we've gone through a pretty big evolution from where open source essentially was something that business just didn't believe in, to when they started using it, to I think when they essentially took it over. And that started with the foundation of the Linux Foundation. I think that was the really big point. And if you remember, the Linux Foundation used to have 2 developer seats on their board. And they removed both those developer seats because Perens of the Software Freedom Conservancy was going to run for one. And she would have won. And she would have tried to steer the organization in a more community-friendly direction. And so they deleted the community seats. And so we haven't really had any community control of Linux Foundation and some of their sponsored organizations in all that time. We have technical boards, so the community controls technical directions, but not management directions. And those are very important. And then we had a question about, well, isn't this going to take some time before we can actually afford to enforce our licenses? And yes, obviously, if we're not collecting any money yet, we have to rely on charity, legal interns, other things to bring lawsuits. And so that's going to be a rough start, but it's actually no worse than what we face as open source developers today. You'll notice even the organizations that are supposed to bring lawsuits, the Software Freedom Conservancy mainly, they're not bringing lawsuits lately. And of course, you always try to settle first. You always try to get them to comply with your license out of court before you take them to court. But you need to be able to take the violator to court. Otherwise, nobody's going to take your license seriously. Okay, Martin, so we have about a minute. So I think I'm going to give you your time back and you can get ready for the next speaker.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a very illustrative talk. I think we all have a lot to think about. It's spurred quite a conversation here. And if you go over to Discord, you find that there's an interesting conversation sparked there as well. So maybe if you can get up there, you'll have some interesting back and forth.